welcome back to the Veritas Project. I'd like to welcome our next guest, Lane Bloome. First off, thank you so much for doing this. I'm really excited about this. I've done several interviews so far, but this one is the one I'm most excited about.
No, that's true. Again, I love finding excuses to talk about this. You'd be surprised how awfully this stuff goes over at cocktail parties. Yeah, apparently not polite conversation all the time. So,
Because I think just from the little you shared with me, what you shared with me is kind of the basis of why I'm doing this project.
okay, yeah,
What you kind of shared with me kind of really gets down to what I'm looking for. So I'm really excited about it.
yeah, absolutely. And one thing I'll add, talking about our experiences, there are also some important differences where although the church I grew up in was very conservative, very typical what you would guess it would be, it never turned out. There were no overt cult properties, nothing that totally. I mean, I was alienated from religion for a while, but my experience wasn't so scarring that I felt I could never go back.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it took a complete reimagining, but the label, it's not. It didn't. It was the way that I situate myself now rests on the fact that I didn't have a 100% awful experience. I did get some good,
Right.
So there were good things that I could still fall back on that weren't overshadowed by the bad. Although there was a lot of it, that it didn't completely overshadow everything.
Yeah, when I first got into it, I was a teenager and depressed and
Yeah.
whatnot. So I got involved with the youth group, and that was a good thing. I'm not sure I would be here if it wasn't for that. But
Hmm.
it's over the years, the last few years, I was just miserable, and it just kind of took a turn. So,
No, absolutely.
but it was something I needed at that time for sure.
Yeah. So I hate to. I asked this for a reason, and I'm not prying. Like, around what year would that have been that you left?
I was like early mid-20s. Like I think, trying to think. I think it would have been about around 6 years ago.
Okay, because I've done some reading, and not reading that I did recently, but it's been about a year or two ago that hypothesizes that a lot of the exodus from religion coincided not accidentally from the recession of 2009.
Hmm.
The national, essentially, it looked on it on a macro level instead of a micro level, but the national morale, there were some odd theories that I didn't quite buy into. But again, like when I hear stories like mine, like yours, I do wonder, maybe if that, there is evidence to support that,
Well, that's
what I think is
interesting.
an odd theory. But yeah.
Can you expand on that a little?
Oh God, let me see. I have my bookshelf here. Let me see if I can really quick. I forgot what book it was. Damn it. But no. So the idea being that people go to church more when, like, again. So this we're talking. I feel like what we're going to talk about today is more on the micro level of what can we do to reimagine
Right.
faith in general and the Christian faith in particular. But this looks more on the macro level of, generally people go to church when they're happy.
Mm-hmm.
Or during times of great despair, such as post 9/11
Right.
or post Pearl Harbor. But when you get situations like a prolonged economic recession, that people just totally disengage from anything like religion, and there were other things that they say people disengage from doing. But that was one that stuck out to me from that book I read.
I think for me it was more of a gradual process.
Yeah.
Because I was leading the youth group at the time, and I was just getting more and more miserable. And I had to be honest with myself. It's like I've been serving this church for like a decade of my life and seeking, Christ and a relationship with Him. And I really had to be honest with myself. It's like I really don't have a relationship here.
Yeah.
I've been serving this long, and I don't have anything to show for it. And
Yeah.
I'm just a total hypocrite. And so when I left, I wasn't trying to disprove God. I read the Bible more after I left the church than I ever did when I was in the church.
I level with you there, yeah.
And the more I looked into it and the history of, Christianity, I was like, I really don't know what I believe at this.
Yeah, no, and to kind of go off of that, I had a similar. You talk about kind of gradually growing out of it, and I would say the same thing. For me, like leaving the faith, which again I never officially did. I was very quiet about it.
Mm-hmm.
Between the ages of like 17 and 19 or so. And for me, it was very much it was like a perverse like a very lonely coming of age.
Right.
For me, developing as an intellectual and, being, still studying to be an academic, I mean, there were some real issues I had to address, and some real inconsistencies that I had to deal with in some way.
Yeah.
And there are two kinds of pressure that makes diamonds and pressure that makes stuff explode. you know? And I knew that there was pressure. I didn't know what kind it would ultimately be. And so again, for me, it was also a process of disillusionment, I guess I would say.
Mhm.
And disillusionment is not a bad thing. The professor I had that taught this history class I took this is one of the first things he said. He grew up in a fundamentalist Baptist church, in Wyoming in the 1940s, and he said that when he went to college, he was just completely disillusioned. That's the one word he used to describe his college years. And he said that he went to a professor of his and said this, and he said, disillusionment is not a bad thing. It's illusionment. It's a bad thing.
Uh-huh.
Disillusionment means the veil is being lifted.
Huh.
You're seeing more of the truth.
Well, that's another reason I was so excited about this, because I've just kind of scraped the surface of everything that you studied. You're more
Mm-hmm.
educated and articulate than I am, so I'm really excited to hear your thoughts on this and kind
Oh
of
yeah,
how you came to this.
I contribute. Yeah,
So I'll just give the floor to you.
for me to have been in the church in a certain sort, to situate myself in the church a certain way as a young person, to leave it in kind of later adolescence, and then to come back in my early 20s was definitely a process of reimagining what faith, what religion, what spirituality is, and ultimately, what is God, which is something I still to this day really try hard to think about, and to try to refine my thoughts through criticism, not not through not I refine my ideas through criticism rather than criticism being a detriment to them. And one of the biggest things that for me is the way that language is used. What do certain people mean when they say certain words? I mean, language in general is such a huge part of our identity.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, what is my identity as a Christian is greatly impacted by the words I use and how I use them. So when I say words like resurrection or faith or believing, I know that I mean fundamentally different things than what more conservative Christians mean by those words. And if I can, so in particular, it's interesting to look at the issue of the Bible for me. That's something that sticks out to me, because again, this is a collection of documents that we have from antiquity that sort of tell us what earlier practicing Christians and Jews were up to and what issues were real in their lives. And there are a couple of different ways to look at the Bible. So the more common way is, or not, I don't even want to say more common. It's more, I'll use the word popular instead of common, because it's not necessarily about how many people buy into this, but about how prevalent it is in our culture, really. Looking at things as like a literal historical record. So you can look at the Bible and say, okay, well, I'm a person in the 21st century, and I'm going to read my 21st century views of what history is and what facts are into this work I'm reading. Which again it's a way to do it. That's certainly one way to read the Bible, and that's where you get a lot of your major problems and inconsistencies. I mean, given that every religion has to deal with and really deal with heavily the problems of evil and suffering, but there are many extra problems that, at least for me, come from reading and understanding the Christian faith through this like literal factual view, this literal historical view of the Bible. You get things like, well, wait a second, is slavery okay? I mean, that's an extreme example.
Right.
But certainly you get stuff like that. You get stuff like, well, what should I do for this person who's cheated on her husband? I mean, the Bible says certain things, what you should do for that.
Right.
And if you read it historically as in a literal sense, you get some ideas that are really inconsistent with other moral teachings, both from the culture and within the Bible itself. You
Right.
get both internal and external contradictions this way. At least, again, through the way I see it, you do.
That's a topic that's come up a lot so far with the people I've been talking with.
Yeah, and that kind of gets into, okay, so what other way can we look at this, right? Because again, to read things like this definitely pre-assumes a lot of our modern 21st century, but more generally post-Enlightenment ideas about what you write as opposed to what you mean.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, the Enlightenment was what we're talking 1850s, I think, if I'm remembering my history correctly. And this is when was the philosophical movement that really made modern science what it is. It put a real emphasis on being factual and on and adding a more rigorous definition of proof, essentially.
Uh-huh.
Trying to get more people could. It developed a scientific method, essentially. It really was a key point in history as far as what we can do now with science.
Okay.
But again, something we lost in translation then is looking at more things like poetry, like understanding more metaphorical work. Again, and this is not a unique problem to religion. I mean, I've heard a number of historians lament people's loss of creativity in the last 50 years, especially. At least a certain kind of creativity. I mean, people don't value the arts the way they used to. Look at band programs being cut in schools, widespread. I mean, people don't value the same sorts of information and the same sorts of human expression that they used to.
Mm-hmm.
So if you kind of trace this back now to looking at biblical writings, so the Bible isn't just one book, of course. It's a collection. The common Protestant Bible is a collection of 66 works that were written between like roughly 4000 BCE and about like 200 CE by a number of different people in a number of different backgrounds. You have people who were Jewish, people who were Gentiles writing them. You have them writing two different audiences. Some were Jews writing to other Jews. Some were Gentiles writing to other Gentiles. Some were early Christians writing to entire towns.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to take all these things into effect, and the way that they communicated varied greatly. I mean, the Jewish tradition has a certain mystic tradition that's within it, a certain faction, and some of those factions wrote certain works in the Bible. So you have to understand that these people were using a very metaphorically rich language.
Right.
Then you have books like the Psalms that are poetry.
Right.
You have books like Proverbs that are really just that, books of Proverbs, books of wisdom. I mean, just a bunch of little sayings. Like Poor Richard's Almanac, almost to kind of draw some parallel there. And people read this as if they're all the same types of work, which is dangerous. I mean, imagine if in 3,000 years people rediscover our society and read The Cat in the Hat the same way they read Stephen Hawking's works. I mean, really, it's a dangerous way to go about things.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, again, that's an absurd example, but
No, you're right though.
yeah. You have to be aware of who was writing and to whom they were writing, and in what way those types of people communicate with each other.
Yeah, because I didn't even know kind of the history of how the Bible was created. I never got into as deep as you've studied with thinking about the audiences that they were going for. But I didn't even know any of that until after I left the church.
Yeah,
You just
and that's no coincidence. Yeah.
You're given this image that the Bible was told by God to these specific people together all in a room or something.
Yeah, exactly. No, and again, there's a multiplicity of voices, a multiplicity of cultures represented. And again, there's a lot of stuff there because these are the books that have been preserved for a lot of time. So there has to. I mean, these books are clearly important to a lot of people for them to survive, for us to see them today.
Right.
But what's the message? What is the importance? That's a different. It frames the debate differently at a very, very cellular level almost.
Mm-hmm.
there's an interesting tangent here that I'll try not to get on too much, but there's an interesting tie between Christianity and Roman imperial theology. So that's the theology with your Roman gods, and then you have Caesar being, God's son, which again, that gets into a different thing, that a lot of the language in the Christian New Testament is very Roman. And you have to understand what the Jewish situation was 2,000 years ago. They were occupied by Rome. And again, these are people whose holy books celebrate their freedom from the Egyptians, from the Babylonians, from the Assyrians, all these people who had, conquered them or taken them into slavery over the years. And guess what? They're being occupied in their own damn land. That's the cultural setting for the New Testament. So if it's interesting that if you take this metaphorical approach to the Bible, you find a number of jabs at Caesar. I mean, if you think about like titles that Jesus has, Messiah, Lord, Son of God, these were a lot of these are, and so forth. A lot of these were titles that were Caesar's. Son of God, Caesar's title. Lord, Caesar's title. That's a political term.
Really?
Like think about landlord. That's what Lord means. It's a political head.
Huh.
Caesar was thought to be the son of God. He was the begotten son of a virgin, which again, not a coincidence. The birth narratives of Jesus and the birth narratives of Caesar are incredibly similar, and that tells a story.
I didn't even know that.
Yeah. The Christian tradition borrowed a lot of this, and for me at least, my analysis says that these writers weren't saying this literally happened, but these writers were subverting the Roman system and saying, no, this is our Caesar. This poor man from the lowest 1% that teaches this everyday common peasant wisdom is our Caesar. That's what I take from the birth narratives.
It's been a long time since I read about this, but like the lost books of the Bible, was it the Roman Empire that kind of picked and chose what books stayed in the Bible?
Yeah, so the evolution of the Bible has had a lot of historical steps, and one of the key steps was the Roman Empire. So the Jewish Torah was canonized, made standard around. Oh, let me find. I made a note of this last night. So the Jewish Torah wasn't even, or the Jewish Old Testament, what Christians call the Old Testament, wasn't really canonized in Judaism until about 200 CE. I mean, the first 5 books the Jewish people had agreed upon long ago, and then they added in some writings by the prophets, but then they added some more things in as late as 200 CE. But then once Christianity was chosen to replace, so Roman imperial theology fell apart around the 300 CE era, and they chose Christianity to be the religion that replaced Roman imperial theology. And again, this gives us a lot of clues into what's going on and why these books were chosen. This was so the original Christian movement was an anti-Roman movement, but the way that it got really propagated into the mainstream was by the Romans claiming it as their own. So around 325 CE, the Council of Nicaea was held, and this was a very large council, and it was, again, held by the Roman government. And they invited bishops from just a wide range of Christian traditions. I mean, some of these were so... we think there's diversity in the church now. It was ridiculous. Not in a bad sense, but it was just mind-boggling how many different kinds of Christian traditions were represented. And they essentially told them to duke it out until one view remained, and that would be the view that was taken as official Roman Christianity. That would later become the Roman Catholic Church, of course. And so they did, and eventually, so of all these views, it ended up being that 7 of them were taken seriously, and there was a real nasty, not fight, but kind of negotiation that happened to narrow it down to 2, and then to one view that is the Trinitarian view that we see today.
Okay.
Anyway, so this tradition's books were kept. Right, so you have most of the books of the Bible, give or take a couple. There were a couple that there were a couple added and subtracted later. This was a major event where they ended up burning the books of a number of traditions throughout the Roman Empire. And the Bible would continue to evolve, of course. I mean, even nowadays, I mean, there's the Apocrypha, which the Catholic faith still has that the Protestant Christian factions don't have. There are some other books that are just escaping my mind right now. But again, I mean, the Protestant Christian Bible is 66 books, but you have more of them in the Catholic faith, and some other denominations pick and choose others. And even along about the time of the Reformation, Martin Luther wanted to boot several books from the Bible. The first and foremost of which was Revelation. Martin Luther did not want Revelation to be a part of the Bible because of all the wild interpretations
that were out. The dragons. We want to get the dragons.
Yeah. I mean, it doesn't make a good movie without a great ending, right?
Right.
What the hell producer's going to buy that? I mean,
those are only Christian movies that are made, or yeah.
Yeah. I just saw Revelation ones Left Behind.
What?
They remade Left Behind.
I watched it. I did.
Oh, really?
It. Yeah.
Really?
Just out of curiosity, it was better than the Kirk Cameron one by all means. He didn't get into all the stuff from the first book that they did in the original movie. It was basically just about the rapture itself and the disaster. Yeah. It's like a disaster movie.
Yeah.
Nicolas Cage and an airplane.
Yeah.
No snakes on it, and his daughter trying to make a runway with a tractor. I don't know.
Oh my!
It was still horrible, but it was better than Cameron's. I did read all the Left Behind books.
Oh, I didn't read any of them, so that's interesting. Yeah,
I mean, it's been a while, but
yeah. No, so I can actually talk about this for a while. So stop me when you feel I've said enough.
Go for
it. It's fascinating the way that the Book of Revelation is seen nowadays and what it was. Just the stark differences. So again, nowadays you have this common idea of Revelation predicting the end of the world and how it's going to happen and how Jesus will return again to do things right that he didn't do the first time. I.e., kill everybody. So again, I hate it. I'm not mincing words here, but it's important to think about what certain words mean before we talk about something like this.
Okay.
To understand the background, the word apocalypse does not refer to the end of the world. So there was a genre of literature popular from roughly 200 BCE to about 108 CE. I think it was mostly in Jewish circles. But anyway, it was apocalyptic literature, and it was just a genre of literature, much like we would have science fiction or fantasy or something like that. It was a type of literature they had, and this was a type of literature that was written in a code, and this code was made because so much of the message was that was me.
No worries.
It was so much of this message was anti-Roman. It was mostly about, making fun of and not really plotting against, but lampooning the Roman Empire. So, these people were in real danger by producing this material. So they wrote it in a code that was gobbledygook to Roman soldiers. I mean, if a Roman soldier were to come across one of these things, they'd be like, this is just the silliest thing I've ever read, and just dismiss it immediately, not realizing that there was another message behind it. And an important consideration here is that around this time, 2,000 years ago, there were global 1% literacy rates. 1% literacy. So, I mean, if you ever get discouraged about the human race making progress, think about that for a second. We have, even countries that are thought of as being third world, 1% literacy rates are just unthinkable. So the way that people got together to share literature was that they would get together, and there's like the one person in town who can read, and these books would come in very long scrolls that the one person in town who could read would read aloud to the crowd.
Okay.
and they would read this metaphorically rich, coded literature, and people would, and the real fun of this was that after the reading was done, people would debate what the meaning was. Again, because it was coded, you had to do a little bit of thinking and, say, well, I think this is what this means. Well, I heard this other apocalypse where they use this allegory to mean this, sort of thing. And that's what apocalyptic literature was. I mean, think about, again, not to demean, but think about like modern science fiction and people going to Comic-Con. I mean, it's a really, it's not a perfect comparison, but that's sort of what it was back then. People came together to enjoy this niche literature that was really anti-imperial.
Huh, interesting.
Yeah. So so this is that's what an apocalypse is. It's a work of apocalyptic literature. And then you also have to understand what eschatology is. So the book of Revelation is a work of apocalyptic eschatology. So it's a certain kind of apocalypse, which I'll kind of describe what that is now. So eschatology refers to the end. And this is where you start getting your really different interpretations of what Revelation is by different understanding of what they're referring to as the end. So the common modern idea behind what the end is it's this fiery blaze that the earth is going to go out in, right? So that's one interpretation. But you also have this interpretation that is more rooted in the times that this book was written. Again, remember that we're talking about Jewish people who are being occupied after being enslaved by the Egyptians and set free, after being held captive by the Babylonian, being held captive in Babylon and then getting free, and then the Romans come in. Damn it, we're slaves in our own land.
Uh-huh.
And if you're a Jewish person, wouldn't you be asking, when's this going to end?
Right.
When is the end? So this word eschatology, if you break it down, the root is eschaton, which means end. So I mean, if you're a person in this culture 2,000 years ago, and let's say they had movies, they didn't, of course. I mean, instead of fiend, they'd have eschaton at the end. Okay. So this is not a word that refers necessarily a fiery. It certainly does not refer to a fiery blaze in every. It could,
Mm-hmm.
But so we're talking about when's this going to end? When's the end coming? When is human suffering going to end? Is a larger implication. So this is an apocalypse about the eschaton. It's apocalyptic eschatology. And that's what the book of, so that's the background of the book of Revelation. That's sort of bringing it up in its own context.
Okay.
So what the book of Revelation is it's saying, here's how God is going to help us work to bring the end. And notice that, I mean, and again, you have to understand, in order to make any sense of this work, you have to understand the symbols. What do these different dragons mean? What are these seals? Why are they given in a certain number? Right?
Mm-hmm.
So notice that and again, I could talk for an hour just diving into those details. I'll stick to the kind of bigger ideas for now, and we'll see if maybe it gets down to the smaller ones later.
Okay.
But notice that the book of Revelation works in cycles, right? Where there are cycles that happen on Earth, but then we switch our view to heaven, to Earth, right?
Okay.
And this is an important structure. Cycles of 7 is kind of the way that the book is structured. You have 7 seals, 7 bowls, so forth. And this is very intentional, and an important part of the message is that you have these. So again, this is cyclical, which talks about the nature of reality, right? Where something happens, something ends, something starts again. So we have these times where we have this domination by Romans starting, we have it where it ends, but then when the good comes, eventually the bad's going to happen again, and the good's going to happen again. So again, the cyclical nature, the cyclical presentation, I'm thinking of another word though. Not formatting, not presentation, but the cyclical structure of this book is really important. It makes a big point about what the people were thinking about the nature of their oppression. And also notice that we have this, we're going from heaven to earth to heaven to earth. or from earth to earth to heaven in this book. And again, the writer is saying, okay, so here's the way we see things. Now let's try for a second to see God's perspective on this, and then we'll come back. And that's really that was the intent of that structure. Very intentional and very meaningful. But again, then you have things like beasts from the land and the sea. What does that mean? And that's one detail I guess I'll talk about now. It's interesting that even though separation of church and state is a very recent and some would argue a very American invention, scholars are reasonably convinced that the two beasts from the land and the sea represent the church and the state in the book of Revelation.
Really?
Two powers that are very destructive, and when they work together can cause real problems for everyday people. I mean, you think about the four horsemen of the apocalypse representing what happens when people conquer. I mean, so if I, again, this is going off of memory, but the four horsemen, the first one is a white horse, right. Which again, the white horse is your war horse. That's your horse you go on when you conquer places. That's like what Alexander, rode down Asia Minor on.
Right.
Right. And then you have your so again you have
the red horse.
So step one is conquest. Step two is oh my gosh, I'm making a fool of myself here. I can't.
The red horse was war.
Yes. Yeah. So and that was the second one. You're right. So you get conquest, then you get war, and then the third horse was the.
I think it was black, which was like famine and pestilence.
Famine, pestilence, and price gouging. I mean, I remember the certain passage when they're talking about this horse of famine. They're talking about just exorbitant prices for food, and again, this is all caused by war and siege and other sorts of, again, natural consequences of, first you get conquest, then you get war, then you get famine, and of course, finally, then you get death.
Mm-hmm.
That pale green, pukish colored horse. Again, this is just saying, look, this is when you people down here on earth do this, when you go out on your white horse and you go out and conquer people, your red horse comes next, then you get your black horse, then you get your sickly green horse last. It's not saying, it's not prophecy, it's not prediction, but it is prophecy. I mean, we have a very Americanized idea of what prophecy is being predicting the future. But that's not what the biblical meaning of prophecy is at all. It's speaking the word of God and God's intent for us and God's message to us, which is, look, you do stupid stuff like conquer each other. This is what happens. Again, this is the interpretation that I've come to. I'm not claiming any infallibility here. Trust me, I'm sure even my details are less than perfect at times.
No, it's really interesting because, basically people usually just interpret it as literal as possible.
Yeah. Well, and even then, I mean, there are even certain things that even people who take the Bible the most quote unquote literally make certain concessions. You don't see them walking around, separating meat and dairy. You don't see them, I mean, even most of your, hardened, literal, factual Christians don't think that Jesus meant that there was a literal prodigal son or, a literal, what's another parable? Good Samaritan, I'm going off on tangent here, but this is another interesting point.
You're fine. Just
the Good Samaritan is a parable. So again, Jesus taught in parables, and these are made-up stories that are meant to make people think about situations in their daily lives and what sort of actions they should take in these situations. And in the tale that we call the Good Samaritan, so the situation here is that we have a man beaten just near death on the side of a very jagged mountain road that's dangerous, and then you have a priest go by, another religious man go by, and third you have a Samaritan go by who's the one who takes care of him. You have to understand that Samaritans were seen as unclean people to the Jews of the time. I mean, these were the people that did not get along. I mean, the way that I see it is, if this movie if this parable were being told today, it'd be called The Good Communist. I mean, it would. The message changes when you try to upgrade these, when you try to translate these to modern day, you have to make certain allowances. So again, I mean, did this literally happen? and most people would concede no, this was a story meant to make a point. Which it's difficult for me to wrap my head around that, but also to say, well, no, all this other stuff should be taken literally. It seems like a very arbitrary standard for what's literal and what's metaphorical. When a lot of this, when even certain things make so much more sense as metaphors or parables or allegories. It's I mean, so at the end of the parable of the Good Samaritan, like many others, Jesus ends with "Go and do likewise." That's the real kicker of this thing. That is the people's cue to start debating. What does it mean to do likewise? I heard a great scholar, John Dominic Crossan. He's a Catholic theologian.
What was the name? I'm going to write it down.
No, yeah, John Dominic Crossan. Okay. John Dominic, and then Crossan.
Okay.
And he says, well, wouldn't the literal interpretation of this story of go and do likewise mean to go trolling up and down the interstate looking for semi-corpses? Really, I mean, if you take this at literal face value, that's what you get. That's what it means to go and do likewise in that case. Mm-hmm. If you're taking this literally, and again, that's not a very rich message, right? It's kind of shaky advice at best.
Yeah.
So even when we talk about looking at the Bible literally, in most frameworks that are used, and especially in popular culture, it's not very literal even. It's a very odd standard that I don't fully. I don't understand the measuring rod for truth in those kinds of frameworks. It's very bizarre to me.
Right. Yeah. Don't read the Left Behind books. Every fucking thing is literal. Every little stupid thing. When they release Apollyon from the gates of hell, and there's a swarm of demonic locusts, and it describes how it had, these locusts look like scorpions with a lion head, and it's stinging everyone, and they're jumping off buildings and can't kill themselves. Like, oh, for God's sake.
It sounds like a really bad Jumanji spinoff. Yeah.
Like, I don't think that's what they meant.
Yeah. And this is where one potential critique of Revelation, at least one interpretation of it, is, so another word that is important to understand in the Christian faith is Messiah. And so again, we've talked about how several of the titles put on Jesus were titles of Caesar Augustus, and all the other Caesars, but at the time it was Augustus. And Messiah is one that was not one of Caesar's titles, but it's a title that has a very interesting meaning that has been lost in translation in most interpretations of the Christian faith. So the Messiah, King David was the prototype Messiah. He was, quote unquote, the first Messiah. And if we think about what King David was, he was a political leader, a king, who was just very charismatic, liked by the people, brought Israel to its greatest prosperity since the written word came around, conquered other countries, had many wives, this sort of thing. So he was the prototype military conqueror. That's what a Messiah was. That's so when the Jewish people around from going around the year, around the turn of BCE to CE were looking for a Messiah, they were looking for someone to conquer, to unconquer them, right? They were looking for some king to come to rise from within them to kick the Romans out and establish them as their own autonomous empire again, or their own autonomous political body. I don't want to necessarily say empire. You could argue if that's what they were looking for or not, but so again, they're looking for this military conqueror, and for Christians to say Jesus is the Messiah is a very interesting statement that has real implications to what the faith is. So if we think about what the Messiah is supposed to be, and we think about who Jesus was, it almost seems like a satire, doesn't it?
A little bit.
So we're talking about a man who's first of all not a carpenter. Jesus was a woodworker. They didn't have enough trees in that area to have actual carpenters build houses and stuff like that. He was a woodworker who would make little trinkets and bowls and small other things. He was an artisan.
Really?
Yeah. So now you can just instead of tables and homes, you can imagine him making little like toys for children and stuff like that. Maybe make a bowl if someone broke one or something.
That's badass.
Yeah. So again, I mean, the artisan class under the Roman social structure was bottom 5%. I mean, so you have like your top 1% that controls 90% of the wealth. Then you have like your merchant class, and then your like quote unquote middle class, which is just people who are treated like shit and slaves, themselves. Excuse my language. I mean, they were treated very badly. These people were essentially slaves, and that's like 80% of people right there. Jesus' artisan class was below these people. So I mean, we're talking someone of zero social status, who was a skilled artisan, who went around preaching peasant wisdom. Teaching to these people who have been socially exiled. I mean, someone who empowered women, someone who empowered not just Jewish people, but people who were Gentiles. So we're talking about someone who really had a radical message for his time. And we're bestowing upon him the title of King David. The Messiah is the Messiah is the person who's supposed to take us out, who's supposed to bring on the eschaton, right? Who's supposed to say, this is the end. This is where Roman imperialism ends in our culture.
Okay.
And to call Jesus the Messiah is to say that he's the person who's bringing that about. Well, what does that mean? How is this peasant preacher who's not of the priestly social class going to do this? It almost reminds you of the pen being mightier than the sword, or the word being mightier than the sword. I mean, that's a profound statement to say, well, this is our Messiah. It's almost a satire. It's saying, no, you got it wrong. What you need to save you from this situation isn't someone to bring out the war horse, isn't someone to overthrow the Roman Empire. It's someone to empower you to live a life that beats the Roman Empire, to live a life that does not enslave you to anyone in this world. It's a very profound statement.
Yeah.
But again, it gets people gloss over this word all the time. Though I really wonder how many people know that the Messiah even referred to someone like King David. I mean, it's a fascinating point to think about.
Yeah, I've never thought about it.
Yeah.
Like kind of reeling right now.
It's trust me. I mean, I took a couple classes on this in college, and I've read it ever since. Because again, that class sent me reeling for 4 straight months.
Oh, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Even just like 40 minutes listening to it, I'm like,
Yeah.
If you've enjoyed listening to Lane's thoughts so far, please join us for the rest of his interview next Thursday, April 23rd. I really encourage everyone to take the time to listen to it. For me, personally, it was very illuminating. Again, if you would like to be on the show or have any ideas for it, you can contact us on our Facebook page, which is linked below, as well as on our YouTube channel. Or you can email us at veritas.project.podcast@gmail.com. Thank you again for listening, and I hope you join us next week for part 2 of Lane's episode.